Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Spectrum Wash Processed Panama from Archer's Coffee. And there's the container right there. And Archer's, based out of Sharjah, United Arab Emirates. And this is the fourth and final part of our Archer series. And the fourth time Archer's has appeared on this channel, as once again, they were originally a suggestion to us by Dan. So for the last time in this series, a shout out to and thank you to Dan for the suggestion. And I don't think it'll come as a big surprise that the final coffee we are reviewing in this series is a high-end washed Panamanian geisha. As a lot of people know that my favorite coffee in the entire world is washed Panamanian geishas. But this one's unique even for me, as I have a lot of familiarity with Savage's coffees. However, I have never in my entire life seen a standard washed Panamanian geisha from Savage, as they do tend to lean a little bit more on the heavier processed side of coffees. So I am very curious to see how this one will turn out. Honestly, I probably would have purchased this coffee from just about anybody because of just how unique it is. Definitely looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, which is a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this one was actually a little bit more tricky than I think I would have expected going into it, as it's definitely still on the lighter side of things by most standards and metrics. It definitely did feel lighter than the natural process Tamasho we had reviewed from Archer's, but I'm not entirely sure where I would go with beyond that, as there were times it felt really light and there were times I'm like, maybe there's a slight bit more development to it. But we will still say that this coffee was on the lighter side by most standards and metrics. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. One thing I should note is that there were only 80 grams of coffee in this container, so this will be a much smaller review. But we will start with day 15, as the coffee definitely didn't act like a washed coffee right from the start, as it did have a very strong aroma to it. But a lot of those factors were also present within the cup itself, as it skewed very heavily on the strong tropical side of things. It felt reminiscent of the slight pineapple and passion fruit aspects that I'd experienced from a fair bit of coffees recently, actually. And most distinctly, I'm thinking of the El Obraje, which is a coffee I keep highlighting because a lot of coffees have felt very similar to that El Obraje. In addition to that, there was the coffee that we had reviewed, the Zorro from Manhattan, that also had a lot of these qualities as well. There's a slight graininess, a bit more vibrant than initially expected, as this was a very vibrant wash processed coffee, and not quite as clean as I would have expected for a Panamanian geisha. Day 18 ran through the Chemex, and there was a very similar experience to it, as it leaned heavily into the tropical aspects in an almost non-washed sense, as the cup just remained so strong and vibrant. Still heavy on the passion fruit with a slight grainy quality yet again, and that was really kind of stumping me, given that I might have expected that through the V60, but running it through the Chemex and getting that graininess was just unique, I would say. The cup felt almost syrupy in so many aspects to it, and that's once again still unique and interesting for the Chemex, so not really sure what to make of it from these first couple of impressions. And on day 21, I ran it through the April dripper, and it was noticeably less vibrant, which was a good thing. The overall cup was just a little bit toned down, especially in terms of the graininess, and I can't really put my finger on why there was as much graininess as there was in those first couple of days. But it also toned down the syrupy aspects as well as the tropicality, allowing for a lot more of the listed stone fruits to define itself within the cup. Honestly, when I went into this one, I was expecting maybe some really strong and high florals as well as some really strong and high stone fruit aspects, but they weren't really overly present for the duration of the time I was drinking this coffee. It really leaned heavily into the more passion fruit and pineapple-like components to it. Definitely a lot of those things present in this one, and the stone fruits were a little bit more of a jammy-like stone fruit, which typically I associate more with the apricots than something like a peach, so the cup felt cleaner. This was probably the best day I'd experienced of this coffee, at least up to this point. But we continue on to day 24, as I ran it back through the V60, and there were similar characteristics once again, as it remained more on the vibrant tropical side of things, with the passion fruit continuing to dominate the cup, just very heavy, very defined. That's why it's very interesting to me that it's not listed as one of the flavor notes that they have on here, because I feel like it's arguably the most pronounced characteristic to it, right alongside that very strong pineapple juice-like component. There are some slight floral and citric aspects to the cup, but they are definitely background characteristics to what is a very strong tropical forward component. Day 28, final notes we have, again, 80 grams, not a whole lot of coffee to work with. Opted for the V60 for the final notes, and I think it's just because based off the two brew methods, the V60 and the Chemex, I just had slight bit more success with the V60, and the cup continues to remain very heavy on the pineapple juice side of things, with the passion fruit aspect being almost equally as pronounced. Definitely present once again, as the cup did feel like it was starting to round about a little bit more, as there was a citric component that was dominating the cup in a very defined aspect too. So very heavy on the fruits. I mean, very strong, vibrant fruits in general. Slightly cleaner, but still very vibrant in general. And that's the word I've used a lot throughout this review, and it's because I just didn't honestly expect that going into it. All right, so let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we were getting. And one level 5, and that is the citrus fruit. So let's discuss that real quick. And as I kind of mentioned, at times there was a slightly maybe undefined citrus fruit component to it. They do have a bergamot listed on here. I'm not entirely sure I see that, as oftentimes I find that to be a maybe slightly more herbal, savory sort of citric components to it. And that wasn't overly pronounced in this cup, but the one thing that was the very kind of sweet pineapple juice-like aspect to it. I don't think that they even have anything pineapple related on here, but jasmine, bergamot, tangerine, apricot, and nectarine. So yeah, definitely different from my experience, but those citrus fruits were by far the most pronounced characteristic for me, and that's why they're the only one that reached that level 5. And then aside from that, we have a lot of level 4s, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4. And truth be told, it was on the lower side of level 4 for the vast majority of the time I was drinking this coffee. Nothing I would have expected. I honestly have never seen a washed Panamanian geisha not score a level 5, at least as far as I can remember. So that part was unique, and that's not going to be a huge selling point to me, as that's one of the main reasons I love Panamanian geishas as much as I do. So don't really know what to make of that one right there. Finish, level 4. Yeah, even with all of those maybe really strong dominant factors to it, it still wasn't overbearing in any sense. If anything, given that I was able to boost the clarity towards the end, I do have to say that it wasn't too bad. I think that's just kind of where this coffee finish was at that level 4 mark. Sweetness level 4, even with the strong vibrancy, the very fruit-forward aspects to it, it wasn't overbearing either, so that's another thing where I don't have too much to say. Pretty sweet in general. All of the Archer's coffees we reviewed up to this point have been pretty sweet, so not too much to say on that. We have some sirens in the background. We'll continue though. Acidity, level 4. Yeah, there was a fair bit of brightness, and that's what I was kind of mentioning, was typically some qualities I associate with lighter profiled coffees as graininess and, of course, a lot of brightness to it. And this one, given how much graininess it had, you could definitely feel that. But given that it acted a little bit like a natural coffee at times, that's where the development came into play. So yeah, interesting where that finished. Florality, level 4. Yes, and that's the thing that I expected was going to be another level 5 in this one, but even then I had a little bit of difficulty maybe picking out a very defined floral aspect to this coffee. You could feel it a little bit more in the background, definitely much more as the cup has cooled and you're able to get past the much more vibrant fruits at the forefront of it. But yeah, not too much to say on that. Body, level 2. I said at times that it was quite syrupy, and that's why it's kind of interesting that I have it down there at that level 2. If anything, maybe it's on the slightly higher side of the level 2. But keeping in mind, this is all in context relative to Panamanian geishas in general. This one felt like it had a little bit more body than I might have expected going into it. Don't think that there's anything else really worth discussing. Maybe the caramel having that level 2 mark for a Panamanian geisha, but once again, that's just because this cup felt candied, as pretty much all of Archer's coffees, with the exception of the natural, have felt a little bit more on that candied sense. So interestingly, I think this is pretty much a representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee, even though this one wasn't necessarily my favorite Panamanian geisha, I actually did have a lot of fun discussing this one because it really came out of left field. And it's so interesting to me, given that my experiences with Savage have been that he does skew a lot more on the heavier processed side of coffees. And going into this one, I'm like, what's he going to do with a wash processed coffee, and how's this one going to turn out? And it turned out a lot more like the coffees I have familiarity with him. So yeah, that was kind of interesting in that sense, but it's always going to be a tough sell to me to have a Panamanian geisha that doesn't score a level 5, and was very much opposite of what I was expecting from the coffee going into it. Based off the way it sounds, honestly, once again, I kind of expected some really vibrant stone fruit aspects to it, maybe some really high florality, but that's not the case I got with this coffee. It just reminded me a lot of the El Obraje Zorro. Is like right in between those two coffees is where this one finished for me. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. If you've enjoyed either of those two coffees, I feel like this is kind of a good middle ground, as it offered a little bit more clarity than Zorro, a little less than the El Brahe, and at the same time a very strong flavor profile to it as well, skewing a lot in that kind of passion fruit as well as pineapple juice direction, which is something I've experienced from a lot of geishas within the past half year or so. So this one was in line with that, and I think that's what helped me pick out the flavor profile in this one so easily and clearly, because I do have to say the profiles within this coffee were very well defined, which is why I'm so confused why my notes are so different from the notes that they have on here. It's just because I have a lot of experience drinking coffees that tasted very similar to this, and both of those coffees tasted very similar to this. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards, and kind of the best way I can leave this review. So I think at the end of this entire Archer series, I wanted to say that I really enjoyed that Key AA. That was my favorite coffee from this series. I think that was a really nice Kenya. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I would love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Spectrum Wash Processed Panama from Archer's Coffee. Thank you for watching.